share some of your boundaries. So, for example, children need to sit with their legs crossed on the mat. Children need to walk inside. Children talking voices inside. Staff need to be at work on time. Okay? Some schools have that when you finish your tea, you must wash your cup and put it back. So what else are some of those boundaries that you have in place? And even if they're no's at the moment, because they're the ones that are most obvious, like no running.
Rules and boundaries are they much?
A rule is a boundary, right?
Yeah.
Whatever your boundaries. In other words, it's what is your boundary that you're needing someone to adhere to? So what are some of them for you? Great. So classes need to be kept tidy.
Cones around the outside swing.
Great. So those warning cones need to be adhered to so that people don't transgress them. Okay?
Put your lid on your croquis.
Okay. Lids on cokies, otherwise they dry out.
I've got one. Say my name once.
Okay.
That's your favorite.
Okay.
At the moment, yeah.
Okay. So a whole list of boundaries. Boundaries because of safety, boundaries because of work needs to be done, exactly, logistics, practicalities, education departments, parents, safety of schools. There was boundaries, a fence boundary. You can't have children jumping over those boundaries, so children need to stay within the school grounds, etc. Could be going for when you leave school, you need to sign out or check out, or someone needs to sign you out. A whole lot of different boundaries, right? As we opened up that conversation last time, the boundary, or when we're talking about alternatives to no, the boundary is similar to a need in that you're fearing that something will happen if that boundary is transgressed. You're fearing that something's going to happen, which is why you're putting the boundary in place, okay? For whatever the reason is. What we're going to look at tonight, which for me is so insightful, is that that boundary is your need, okay? So when you're saying children need to stay inside the building or children need to sit with their legs crossed, it's because that's what you need to happen. And that's a very important distinction to make as we start unpacking tonight's session, is really getting that this is about you. And it's not necessarily about them in its totality. First and foremost, it's because you need something. That's why you're putting the boundary there. Because what we're going to open up as a conversation is that when your boundary is not being met, in other words, they overstepping the boundary, do you spend your time blaming and accusing them for them not meeting your need, or do you put your time and energy into supporting them in adhering to what you're needing? There's a big difference. Okay? So if someone steps over your boundary, do you spend the time accusing that they've now stepped over the boundary? Or are you aware that actually it's your need that you're asking them to meet, and therefore it's in your best interest that they meet it, not in theirs. It's in your best interest, which therefore implies or opens up the conversation, how can you support them in keeping the boundary for your need as opposed to blaming them that they're not adhering to it? Because it's actually you that boundary is for, which changes quite a lot of how we engage with children around that. Okay. So if you're turning over onto the next page, there's this little kind of graph thing which says when you lose it. So Gavin, that one there, this one here. So take a look here, because this is where you'll see yourself in part of your experience of boundaries. So you might say to someone, this is where the boundary is, and you would expect that to be adhered to. You then find that your child or the children in your class step over that boundary, and actually you feel a bit frustrated about this, right? So you then might be complaining with them. That complaint can turn into anger if it keeps persisting. In other words, it's not resolved. And then it gets worse and worse. In other words, your emotional attachment to it gets higher and higher and can turn into anger, rage, where then a lot of teachers might say, well, that's it. I'm going to give you detention. I'm going to keep you in. I'm going to do something to you. No more break time for you. No more sport for you. I'm going to phone your parent. Okay, so there's this increasing sense of frustration. The challenge with that, and as it says here, is that as you increase in your resentment, you're also losing your power for that boundary to be actually effectively adhered to, because you're moving more into an unconscious space as often those emotions start clouding part of your judgment and what your words are. So part of what we want to look at then and open up as a conversation is what I would like to introduce to you is, for me, the three key areas of boundary setting, which I'll quite comfortably guarantee that if you're not strong in all of them, you will not get the result that you're wanting. A real powerful question for you to ask yourself is when something's not working for you with regards to boundary, is ask yourself, what did I assume was going to happen? What did I expect was going to happen? So if you're in play ball and they're not adhering to what you had asked them to do, right? The question to ask is, what did you assume was going to happen? And you would probably share that you assumed that they would therefore keep all the balls to themselves, or that they would adhere to the boundary. In any area where you feel frustrated about something, it's because you had assumed something else was going to happen and it's not happening now. So a frustration is just an unmet expectation. The expectation that you had is not being met, and that's why you're frustrated about something. Take a look at any boundary that's been transgressed for you. Okay? You expected and assumed that children would do X, Y, and Z, and they're not, and therefore you're frustrated about that. And that's really useful because you can see now what's driving it is you had thought that they would. That's really what you're saying. I had thought that if I asked you to keep the Coke lids on, that you would do that. And you find now the Coke is all on the floor or broken or dry. You're frustrated. Why? Because you had asked them to, and they haven't. Right? So a frustration is an unmet expectation, is a very useful insight into where you thought that something was going to happen and it's no longer happening now. So in the boundary setting, there are three, for me, core components of boundaries, which if you're not strong in all of them, you're not going to get the result.